The problem is that, well, not a problem, but the fact is that in the last, since World War II, we've had globalization, we've had, the World Trade Organization, we've got, free trade, which the present administration in America has taken a sledgehammer to.
How do Africans store knowledge? So we have a whole tradition of elders. We have a whole tradition of inheritance that actually preserves it.
People, I think, have little idea of how much they're affected by the culture that they're in.
The only way you conquer a people is when you give them an idea of God.
Africa is a paradox, a land of plenty that is hungry, a land of wealth that is poor, a land of freedom that is still in chains. Africa weeps, Africa hopes, Africa prays, Africa dances. But most of all, Africa waits. Waits for her people to wake up, for her leaders to grow up, for the world to look up, and for her history to catch up. Thank you so much for accepting to have this conversation with you. I will start with introducing ourselves to our viewers. My name is David Jolie Muganzi, and I'm a medical doctor, young person, interested in changing the position of Africa in the world. And we are going to be having conversations with Zac and Ian. They have rich knowledge. They have been to many places in the world. They have read lots of things. They have done a lot. And they have a lot to teach us. And they have a lot to learn while talking to each other. And with that, I'll just allow each of them introduce themselves, and then we get into the discussion.
David, you are setting us up.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Everything you say is like, excuse me. So please. So let me just begin by saying I'm only human. And that explains my connection with Ian, just 2 human beings. But so let me speak for myself. I mean, I am very confident Ian is beyond the bar you have set. But
And beyond what?
Beyond the bar you have set. So the bar you have set is too low for you. But anyway, just kidding. Zac Niringiye, I think I'll let really say that I grew up rural, went through the education system here, traveled broadly. I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm married. I have children, I have grandchildren. Yeah.
I think that the interesting thing about Zac and me, he's come from different corners of the world. I come from Ireland. He's born in Kisoro. That's that little place that joins the Congo.
Actually, did you know that coordinate 0 is in Kisoro?
Yeah.
It's Mount Sabinyo.
Yeah.
So we are the originators. We are the first coordinate. We are the totally authentic Ugandan.
We've heard of Lucy. This is the Ugandan Lucy. No, but I think
we should be organizing pilgrimages. I have a business idea. Pilgrimages to coordinate 0.
Exactly. The 3 countries, Rwanda, Uganda, and DRC.
It's Uganda, Rwanda, and DRC. It's one spot where you have all 3 countries.
And for me, I come from County Armagh, which is where a lot of the, when they had the troubles in Northern Ireland, there was a place called Newtown Hamilton, where they used to have a lot of booby trap bombs, and the British Army had to fly in and out in helicopters. That was kind of around the area where I was born, County Armagh, in the part of Ireland that's under the British. And,
So is this part of Northern Ireland?
Part of Northern Ireland, yeah.
Okay, so you
subsequently migrated to the Republic. Actually, I was anyway. Not to get into too much detail there, but I think it's interesting. I would say, you said, you Well, to me, you're a scientist because you did physics.
Yes, that's correct.
You did doctorate in physics, didn't you?
I know. I was pursuing a master's when I quit, so my PhD is in theology.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're a PhD in theology.
Yeah.
So religion, philosophy, science,
Yeah.
and I suppose another thing I was thinking they have in common. We were both under at one stage the Church Mission Society, which was the very famous.
That is true.
Mission.
That is true.
And I would say I'm a scientist, I'm a medic, not a doctor, but very much probably philosophic religion as well.
I think the other thing about you, since you dared say that my introduction wasn't enough, you needed to beef it up. You need to beef up yours. The entrepreneur, astute businessman, and we won't get into the businesses he has started, but it's amazing how he has been able to combine all that. But you are a father, you are a grandfather.
Yeah. But here's another thing I'll say about me. I've got a low boredom threshold, so that's why I started a lot of business.
Actually, there's a sense in which we share that.
Interesting to me how the two of us are drawn together over a long period of years. We've always enjoyed conversations. I think since maybe the first time I remember hearing you preach in that person's house. You did an evening service or something.
Yeah.
And I thought, my goodness, here's a man you were a bishop. An active bishop.
No, I wasn't actually.
No, you weren't even a bishop.
I don't even think I had yet joined the Church Mission Society.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I think you had finished. Anyway, it must be over 25 years ago.
Oh, definitely. It's 25 years, no more. And actually the difference, the thing was that when I listened to you, I thought, this guy really thinks about things, which is funny because you think all preachers, all people who are standing up in front of somebody, should have something to say. But what you realize is a lot of people are just saying dogma. They're just, this was my training, this was what I bring out. And they haven't really thought deeply. That's the problem.
So Ian, we and I have talked about this a lot. The caricature of being a religious leader. Oh my goodness. I don't know that there's any such caricature about being a doctor, but I think the caricature of being a religious leader is so everything you've said. So first of all, the idea that anybody who stands up must have something to say, you hope. And then what you just said, the majority of us actually don't, because we take people for granted. We take religion for granted. And there is a way in which, I don't know, we'll talk about it.
Well, to me, it's dogma. It's dogma. But I think...
So you think it's dogma?
A lot of it is dogma in the sense of, this is what I believe as a Catholic, as a Protestant, as a Muslim, as whatever, and this is my dogma. And so, and then people develop it into strange things and into extreme things. But one of the issues and why we connected is because there was something a bit deeper, maybe a seeking, that one wanted to find something below that just, they say, this is a cliche, the religion that's a mile wide and an inch deep. Really, you're looking at deep questions like the meaning of life.
I don't know. I think I would say, even without assigning depth or shallow or breadth or whatever, I would simply say we were possibly drawn together by a certain level of peace with doubt.
Oh, that's a good way.
So
that's good.
I think the two of us, I certainly remember this, that at a time when you were grappling with deep issues of your own life, I was myself grappling deeply with things I had believed and was questioning, and I was reading the scriptures, and I really couldn't find basis. So I think there was a connection so I think maybe it's the very thing we said at the beginning, there must be something more.
Yeah.
There must be something more. There must be something more to what we've been told. There must be something more to what we have believed. There must be. And I think with that, there's a sense of doubt. So absolutely, seekers. I think that is true. But isn't it later when we really began to name this?
Oh, yeah.
As we grew to become very close friends and
talked to each other about all our life experiences, all our deep thoughts and so on, I think then we realized, hey, we seem to think on the surface of things, we believe different things, but actually it seems to be there's a core that connects us.
I think one of the things you said, I think you were the one who said it at one point, was about being a seeker. I mean, maybe it wasn't you said it, but to me, that's one of the things that I would always have an affinity to someone who's a seeker. I don't care where they're coming from. If they're a seeker after truth. And I don't really think it really matters where you start from. But it's when you start with the dogma, the belief, and then
I can't remember when
go beyond that.
Because it was a turning point for me. Because, as you recall, given your background, you came here as a missionary, which was my first knowing of you.
He doesn't like missionaries, Benny. Anyway, we'll say that.
And at the time, I was enamored by the notion of missionaries. I honestly was. But then, which you said yourself, but we are making a connection of when. So for me, when you then literally abandon the things you believed and you talk for yourself, I don't even want you to abandon what you kept. And then I think there was a way in which we began a conversation in which I would feel like you're saying to me, you believe in God and I don't. You believe in religion and I don't. I was like, no, Ian, I'm just a seeker. And you say, so I actually remember that moment. And that's the moment that I think even our conversation changed. We were willing to have conversations about anything and everything because precisely I'm a seeker.
Yeah.
I'm willing. So and I'm really, really grateful from the time that did happen. There's another very, very dear friend for whom this was a similar experience, who is actually a Muslim, a Muslim imam. And we since became very close friends because we're both seekers. And we seek something deeper, mightier, more profound, greater than us, than me. So, yeah.
There's a book which had a big influence in my life, The Road Less Travelled. Do you remember the author of that book?
No, I don't.
Anyway, I really liked that book. I read it a couple of times. But actually the book led him to Christian faith. But one of the things that disappointed me in his books after that was that he became much more confined in his seeking, because it's like he had found it, Yeah. And look, I'm not saying that. I mean, when you started off by saying that you're a follower of Christ, of Jesus, I think you said, and I think that when you say something like that, it can be cliched and it can mean different things to different people.
Yeah,
I know what it means to you.
yeah,
and I think that I would just like people to keep an open mind. We just discussed the death of the Pope. And the Pope was a great man, obviously. But he was also a man who was curtailed by the institution in which he was in. And there's things in that institution that I would profoundly disagree with, that no Pope was ever dared to address. Like celibacy, like the attitude of family planning and so on. And it's because we're curtailed by the institutions we're part of, by the culture we're part of. That's another thing that I think brings us together, because we've experienced different cultures and we understand our roots, and we understand, sometimes what makes us tick, but also prepared to be open to other influences.
I think in addition to not only maybe understanding, is that we are questioning, we're interrogating of our own, the assumptions within our own roots, our own formations. So isn't it true that understanding presupposes a level of questioning? Because there's a way in which you really don't understand anything until you begin to question what it's about. So I think part of really what my relationship with you has done is improve the questions I ask of my own culture. because we are human. So
Yeah.
I was going to say, since you referenced the Pope, a friend sent me a text and said, the Holy Father has passed, and her comment was, of course, may his soul rest in peace. And I said, first of all, my response was, I think of Pope Francis less as the Pope, but more really his story as a follower of Jesus. And that's what I said. The Pope was a follower of Jesus. Actually, that's what I put on X. And I find that there's something in here, because we all, whether we like it or not, we're all part of a culture, we're all part of some institution, and we are all held by the dictates, the boundaries, the assumptions, and we live in them. But I think that the Pope was profound, I mean, as far as I can tell, in some of the ways, even the way we've read the scriptures. He was bold to challenge some of the traditional understanding. So I think the questioning and all that. So anyway, I think that back to what connects us, it's that questioning, that inquiry, that seeking. So, and I'm really, really grateful that our paths crossed.
Yeah, well, one of the things I said, about you was that you had a background in science. And I think that's I find that very important, because if you look over the last 200 years, the Enlightenment, or even the last 400 years, the search for truth in the scientific manner, the null hypothesis, we were brought up in that. I find that extremely important, and while you can't apply that, there's so much that we don't know, and we know we don't know. You can certainly apply it in medicine, and you can certainly apply it in many of the sciences. But I think it is a very good basis for inquiry, and I'm a bit concerned that today there's a wholesale departure, particularly we see it in Trump's America. There's a wholesale departure from people, basing our progress on science, on scientific method, and on science. Some people make fun of me, like, oh, science, or you're always science. But I think it's the thing about science is that the current method of science is that it's there to be disproven. Those are the guardrails. Once you say something is absolute, and you cannot disprove, or whatever, then that's saying, well, if we go back before Galileo, to the sun revolves around the earth. That was a.
So I guess we go back to. I usually talk about the religion of politics and the politics of religion. And I think it's possible to also speak about the religion of science and the science of religion, in this sense, that as soon as scientific processes, discoveries become absolutized, they turn into dogma. Newtonian, so my background was physics. So the Newtonian physics was classical. There are certain laws that govern. And there was a time, you were going to Galileo, there was a time, when they discovered that there was something more than the earth. It is more. That religion began to be dogmatic about what that more looks like, or what does it not look like. So when Galileo says, no, there is much more, we don't even know what that much more is. But there were scientists who thought indeed that was all. I mean, the scientists who thought Newtonian physics was all there was. That becomes dogma. That is Einstein. There is much more and much more. So actually, it is true that my interest, people ask me, how is it possible that you, who started your journey, intellectual journey at levels of thought and was physics, how then did you go into theology? And I said to them, it's actually very logical, because In my third year, and then postgraduate, taken an interest in nuclear physics, in quantum physics. And the question, I still can remember this as a third year student, grappling with the question about the nature of physical reality. Because if you are Newtonian, the way in which the Newtonian physics works is nature is particles.
Yeah. And
then
it's all very logical.
Absolutely. And then you move in and you lose the idea of its particles. You lose it. Then you get into probability theory.
Exactly.
And then the real question that hit me was, what's the nature of physical reality? And then I read a book.
Yeah.
And it was written by a physicist, but it was actually a book on philosophy. And I just realized, no,
they're very closely related.
Yeah.
What do you call a cat? The cat. What's the cat that you can't tell whether the cat's in the box, out of the box?
Schrodinger's cat.
Exactly.
Schrodinger equation. And of course, coming to conclusion, Schrodinger equation was not derived.
No.
Amazing. And I could go on. So that's actually my journey from my interest in physics, because when I was doing a master's, my interest was in both ends, astrophysics, because I was fascinated by the vastness, Milky Way and so on. But I was also fascinated by the infinitesimal, the atom, and then the breaking it down, neutrons. And now it's even much worse. The electron has been broken down, and so I mean, I don't have any clue now. So, but those two, but you can't do that and ask. There must be much, much more. And so, asking about who is God has been my perennial, my lifelong quest, my lifelong question, honestly. And I think, back to the introduction, the reason I say I'm a follower of Jesus is that I take seriously the definition or the revelation, the story of Jesus of Nazareth is compelling for me as a basis for the search, seeking God.
No doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt. Yeah. And I think it's circular. You come full circle, because I started off by saying you take the null hypothesis and you take scientific basis for actually moving forward in terms of our understanding of this world. And then the more you move into it, as you've said, when you get into the micro and the macro, you just like, man, this becomes too much for our mind in many ways. So I think that, did you say the religion of science? I think a true scientist can never say, such a person can never say I'm an atheist, because
Absolutely.
can ever.
Absolutely.
If he's a true scientist.
Yeah.
And that's where you come back to seeking. So, you're looking at these things and anyway, for it maybe becomes too complicated for some people, because
I think so, actually for me, I think the question, who is God, is very basic. It's not complicated. I think religion complicates it because it dresses it up. Because the corollary to that question is, what does it mean to be human? And both questions.
No.
Both questions.
Well, I had a friend who was a preacher, Barney Coombs, and he used to, when I was when I went to the church we went to in Ireland, which was non-denominational church, and Barney used to talk about the fingerprints of God.
Yes.
And I love that expression, because it's almost like you can see God, but you can see the evidence.
The fingerprints of God. I love that.
And that comes into your own life often. Because I often look at my life and I'm like, my goodness, how did this happen? How did all this stuff happen to me? Anyway, it's
I talk about glimpses. Yeah, glimpses. Anyway.
So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
You are welcome to the Two Sages podcast. That is how two sages introduce themselves. On this podcast, we are going to be having discussions about life, about the world, about God, about the deepest of things that there is to be human. And I think we have...
Hopefully also the shallowest.
We're going to go up, down.
Life is at every level.
and we have a gift of these two incredible men. And since we're in Uganda, I just want to reference that they have seen more Uganda than more than half of the population. That is a fact.
It's actually worse than that. In
Probably
the last,
3/4.
no, it's worse than that. It's the last census. Only about 2% of the population of Uganda are 65 years and above.
So they have seen more Uganda than 80% of the population. That's interesting, and I like the fact that you've introduced yourselves this way. It is great that you've gone beyond the borders of I am Ian, I'm Zac, and this is what I do. I think we've gotten to know more about who you are, and I get that you are seekers, you are looking for more. And you can see that just your introduction has led us to science, to history, to religion, to politics. And I want to start with a quote to start our conversation today. And the quote is by a political scientist and a philosopher, and in my books, one of the greatest thinkers that has come from Africa. And I will allude to that based on your conversation. You have had a conversation about politics, science, religion, and quoted Newton, Einstein, the Pope, and barely an African. But we shall get to that. So the quote says, he is called Ali Mazrui. Ali Mazrui was born in Kenya, in Mombasa, and he grew up in Kenya and later started his career in Uganda at Makerere University. And during a means time, he left for the US, where he taught at Stanford, he taught at Columbia University, and I think he got also a doctorate from Oxford. And one of the greatest things that he did is a docuseries on what it means to be Africans. I think it's called The Africans, Triple Heritages. And this quote that I'm going to read is from his works. It says, "It can be said that Africa invented man. The Semites invented God, and the Europeans invented the world, or at least the idea of the world." That is Ali Mazrui. I'll read it one more time. "It can be said that Africa invented man, the Semites invented God, and the Europeans invented the world, or at least the idea of the world." You have discussed about man, you have discussed about God, and you've touched a little bit about the idea of the world. I will leave it open to first get what this quote gets you thinking. What does it bring to your mind?
Well, I'm not sure. I agree with them about Africa invented man. There's lots of evidence for that, for the origins of man. Even if you had 0.0 and
0.0
and Lucy and Ethiopia and so on, and a lot of the anthropology, definitely agree with that. And I would agree with them about the Semites and religion. To me, it's amazing how all that so much comes from the Fertile Crescent and comes from the little Jews and the Arabs and all that. I'm not sure that I agree with them about Europeans inventing the world. I think maybe the modern world, maybe Western civilization as we know it, but that's a relatively new, that's only 200-300 years, maybe 400 years, I don't know, something like that. Goes to Christopher Columbus, I would say 400 years. In that time.
It's, yeah.
And that, Western
15th century.
Yeah, I think Western Europe came in then, but, the center before that, I mean, you could say China was a great civilization until it was shut down. You can certainly say that, the waves of through Central Europe, and, the Ottoman Empire before that. There's so many different places. So maybe slightly disagreeing with that. Maybe say the modern world. Interesting now where it's going to go to. I think that's interesting in the light of that to look at the future. What's the future for Africa? I mean, there's people go on and say Africa. I heard some businessman talking about. Africa has this potential. It's so many young people in Africa. These things are true, but will Africa realize its potential? To me, that's one of the driving forces in my life. Why I live here, why I've been here, is just that I see so much potential in Africans. People like David here, And it's a question of, but is Africa going to come forward in the next century? And I think that's a huge question, because it's marginalized at the minute in terms of business. What is it? 2% of business comes from the continent of Africa. Scientific. I was at a conference in terms of the amount of money that comes to Africa for scientific research is piddling, nothing, and so on. I'm interested where we could take that as a summary of the past. Now, where's the future?
Yeah, I think you did say about our points of connection. One other thing that really fascinated me about you was your interest in the roots of people, history. So one other thing that happened to me in my search for being human God was history. I regret that my teachers, my secondary school teachers, did not teach history in a way in which it connected who I am, who we are today, to that history. And by the way, another footnote, I think that history is one of the subjects that's so badly taught.
Bias.
No, it's badly taught. Everything is biased.
I totally agree with you.
Everything is biased. But the bias is, it's taught so badly. That's one. The other subject is taught very badly is mathematics. So you have, mathematics is taught so badly. So you have too many students, too many kids who don't like mathematics. But I say to them, the world is mathematical. Everything is mathematical. But everything we are, if you don't grapple with history. So I think the comment that Ian makes about Professor Ali Mazrui's, the quote you make, I associate myself with it. It's important to characterize what is this world that Mazrui is speaking about. It's the modern world, absolutely. But as we were talking about it, as I thought about it, I thought Mazrui himself, the reading of this, you've got to ask what informs Marzui's reading? And truth be told, he was Kenyan, Zanzibarese, Swahili. I think he's in the intersection of the Africans and the Arabs, which is an amazing history. And his roots in Islamic culture was very, very much rooted in Islamic culture. And I really, to some degree, some of his writings were amazing because they reflected something of his Arab culture. But as a philosopher, somebody who engages, I find that most of his work was informed by his Western education. So I would say that quote is maybe tongue-in-cheek for him. Yeah. Maybe he's not saying this is what is, but I think as a result of his own reading, Oxford, Columbia, this is the way the world as we experience it today, given to us through particularly Western eyes. And therefore, the dominant religions today are religions that, connect to the Near East, so the Semitic. But truth be told, there are huge sections of the global population that have absolutely, we can go to Chinese, Hinduism. It's not born and bred, in Semitism. It's absolutely not. And these are, as Ian points out, these are very old civilizations. So I think it's the modern world shaped by Western ideas that date from the late 15th century. And in that sense, yes. And I think itself, the quote is a critique of how we see the world, unfortunately. And the way in which we see the world through those three things is actually problematic. And I think that as I thought about it after you read it, the first statement, the origins of humankind are in Africa. I don't think I think that is evident.
I don't think that's under debate.
I don't know that that's under debate. But the second two things he says are all debatable. They are all completely limited because of the Western idea.
Well, I would say, in the religious sense, I've been struck So more recently, I've just read a book about Israel. It's called Rise Up and Kill, and it's really about the activities of the Mossad and the various services that they have, where they have a targeted assassination policy. Now, it's defensible in the sense that they had all these suicide bombers who were coming into Israel and killing themselves, and they
Do you really want us to go there? Because
just a minute. Let me.
so please.
So we'll get
As soon as you said it's defensible, I was like, just state what it says. Then we.
Anyway, so the book is not controversial. The book is an eye opener in terms of the policy. It gave me a real grounding from before the state, from the British mandate right through to it stops in about 2014. There needs to be another one afterwards. But what really struck me about that was how closely the people who are now fighting each other to the death, the Islam, Christianity, and Christianity not so much involved, but Judaism, to the death. And they're all related to the same, they're all related to Christ, in fact, when you come to Christ and pre-Christ and, the Torah and so on. They're all brothers.
Yeah, but Ian, one of the, it's massive because there's an assumption by many, especially the popular versions of God. So I would say that when he says the Semitic cultures of the Near Eastern periods were the origins of today's popular ideas of God.
Yes, I mean, you can trace it back about 2,000, 3,000 years.
No, but I think that if you really do the hard scholarship work, you will discover that the narrative itself in the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah, the prophets and the writings, and I'm not in any case a Jewish scholar, I'm not a scholar of Judaism, but I have a dear colleague and a dear friend whose scholarship is in this field. And one of the things that has been freeing me is to hear him describe how it's actually erroneous to argue that the Old Testament scriptures themselves, the Hebrew scriptures, have only one idea, one imagination of who God is. And the idea Yahweh, the God of Israel, as a way of imagining who God is within the story of Israel, is actually not the same idea that you read.
If you trace back,
even to Genesis.
Yeah.
Even the Genesis account.
Yes.
The language used about God in Genesis 1 is not the same language used about God in subsequent Exodus.
Yes.
So I think that the idea of God, the imagination of this reality named as God, and of course it's complicated because we're using the English language. And the English language nuances God in ways in which my mother tongue doesn't. One of the things I always say to people is, so back to Mazrui's idea of God. So when Mazrui said the Semitics gave birth to God, origins of God, I mean, in our cultures and traditions, my culture, my tradition, my history, the word used for God is Iman. Iman. And the thing that is interesting here is that we don't have a he, she gendered pronoun. So when you want to say God did, in English you would then say, in order to avoid repetition, that God did, you say he did. But in my mother tongue, you don't have the problem of he did, she did. It's God did. It will always be God did. And we don't even have the idea of God and gods. Iman and Iman. There are no. So so again, back to Ali Mazrui. I think what Ali Mazrui is simply saying is that his quote is a critique of popular notions of God, and secondly, popular notions of the world. And back to your question, Ian, I think that this emergence of China as a global economic power is going to have a huge impact because
one of the things that led to Europe's idea of the world conquering us is simply a way in which Europe imagined economy. And so this, quote unquote, the discovery of the new world, to fund and to power European industrialization and all that, I think is related. So I think that the point you raised about Africa's role, business, economy, is actually related in terms of imagining a different future. Because right now, China conquers Africa. You know, how many countries are not as indebted to the teeth to China, and not anymore actually to America.
These things are all interrelated.
So absolutely. So I was going to say that I think Mazrui, his scholarship is outstanding, but yes, he engaged in a world shaped by that European modern idea of God, European missionaries. And by the way, because I've read a little bit more of him, he has a huge debate, a whole discussion around Christianity and Islam. And he actually argues later that Islam is more African than Christianity. And he actually argues in his work that Islam is much more attuned to the ideas of God in Africa but that is not what it's about. So yes, as soon as you quote Mazrui, we have to ask, who is Mazrui? Where is he coming from? Because there is absolutely no view that is not informed by history, by context. So, but what he says is that in this historical moment, we have to grapple with that reality, that the world shaped in the image of Europe is too dominant, and it's here with us, but it's not going to be here forever.
And I would come back and say that the world shaped by the Semite views of God is the world that we're living in today as well. And you're right, yes, China could come back, and then you have a whole another sort of historic religious force. But if you trace back, you said about the time when the Torah and the laws were written, there were various views of God that were coming. So you're looking at origins that came in, the stories of Abraham, the stories of the lost tribes, and going back, and the interpretation of the Torah and so on. But to me, it was distilled around the between, I don't know, BC, somewhere between a few hundred years BC up to AD, when the Bible became, a book that was accepted, the Torah was accepted, the teachings of the prophet were accepted, and that was all distilled around this period, not that long ago. I mean, this is between 1,500 years ago and 2,500 years ago, and that has had a profound influence on how we think, on modern religion, and that those religious views. What I'm saying is now they start there in the same point, and then they go into extremes.
But Ian, I really am curious. I don't know, and again, I haven't read much of this, but much more aware that we are speaking. You and I are speaking the European language. It dominates. So is French, so is Spanish. These are the languages of conquest that colonized the world. And the attempt to colonize China and India and so on. And I'm just thinking, if somebody who is in the heart of China hears this poem, this quote rather, by Ali Mazrui, and there is a vast world, Hindu, Indo-China, vast world that has a much longer history, that has not even experienced this kind of colonial conquest. There are empires, conquests that happen within the East and the Southeast and so on, that are completely outside the experience of the European conquest. Because the European conquest, as my own reading, and it's limited, is really, it emerges out of the end of the 15th century. And by the way, is directly connected with the spreading of Christianity. The edicts, the papal edicts, the bulls that authorize Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, the princes of Portugal and Spain, to essentially discover the world, conquer and kill and massacre and extort.
That's
and
why he
plunder.
doesn't like missionaries.
And plunder was really an authority given by the Pope. I mean, the Pope Bulls of 1452, 1493, they're all there. So I think it's true that we must grapple, and I agree with you, for us, in this part of the world, conquered by Europe, and subsequently, even though that whole European conquest, we must grapple with what is just said. But I wonder whether this is something that Chinese have over us. They speak a language we who come from this part don't understand.
Yeah.
Is there a world they are bringing we absolutely have no clue about? And is it time maybe to understand that world that is conquering us now with the Huan? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting topic, which I need to read more about.
Same here.
Yeah. But have you read Yuval Harari's latest book? Nexus, yeah.
No, I haven't.
That's an interesting one in terms of what I've been saying about there was a confluence at one time at which the beliefs in God and even Jesus, the Bible, the Torah, and these things became concretized. And here's an interesting, because he writes Nexus in the context of communication. Essentially, this idea that, this is another subject, but the idea that you just put all the information out there and that will help the world and let everybody say what they say isn't actually true, can actually lead to a lot of issues. But at that time, he said basically it was a search for the Word of God. People wanted the Word of God. But the problem is, for example, when Judaism got the Word of God, it came as the Torah, was it? Then they had to have people interpret the Word of God. That's why you have the Hasidic Jews who are continually interpreting. So getting the final word, but there was a lot of stuff that was concretized around that period of time.
I am trying to remember the author, which is another good book, A History of God. It's a fascinating book by the name of the other name is Armstrong. I forget the other name. A History of God, and it traces precisely what you said in a different way. So I don't know and it actually traces this idea of God within the three traditions. Judaism as the first, and then Christianity and then Islam. And it's amazing what she does in that work. Karen Armstrong, A History of God. Karen Armstrong. And she's done a lot more work. She's really the authority in terms of the Western tradition of the whole idea of religion and God.
Anyway,
and that conversation.
Maybe we should live away from them.
I have some.
Let me put it this way. The reason why this conversation is critical, the only way you conquer a people is when you give them an idea of God. And they buy the idea of God. Because you see, conquest demands a religion. You can't conquer the world without a religion.
So
that's my view.
So before we leave that, I want to get your comments on something. There's a word he uses here. Probably the word he uses the most in this plot is invent. Invent means it was not there and now it has been brought. So he says Africa invented man. Maybe we shouldn't go down that path. But then he says the Semites invented God. And so which means there's a point where there's no God and now there is God.
But I think we're talking about the modern gods.
Ready to and then he says the Europeans invented the world, or at least the idea of the world as we know it. So I want to give you some more something to think about the part where he talks about the Semites invented God. There's this book, one of the most pivotal books I have read. I read in my teens. It's called The Origin of Consciousness by Julian Jaynes. And it's the only book he wrote throughout his life. He was grappling with the question of consciousness. And in this book, he shows us that consciousness was not always there in human beings. And there's a point at which our brains were different from the way they are now. And he calls it the theory of the bicameral mind. Mm-hmm. And he says there's a point at which our brains were literally split into two, and the left brain was not communicating with the right brain. And the idea of God started from that breaking down. The structure of our brains breaking down from bicameral to what they are now. And he uses also a historical context in that he analyzes and shows you how bicameralism reduces throughout the Old Testament, how bicameralism reduces throughout literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And he also shows you he calls them vestiges of bicameralism in modern day world. And all this is going back to the idea of God being invented. But that's not where I want us to go. Well, because we are speaking about Africa.
There now.
Yes.
That was. You didn't say that we can't discuss.
You continue.
All right.
As they say, extend a bit.
So how that connects to this, because I've been listening to you and you've been talking about the idea of God. And right now, if we started discuss, if we ask people the idea of God to them, it wouldn't include someone or people that are on Mount Olympus. So it's so torn apart from us right now. It wouldn't include maybe someone that can come out of the lake and maybe order you to kill your wives, or it wouldn't include there are many things that were there then that the idea of God right now does not include them. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And in the things that includes the idea of God right now, there's very little of it that is of African origin. And the last thing that I want to say as you get to comment is something that I read about how we have been left with a male God who begot a male son with nothing to do with a female. And now we have a world where the feminine has been put to the margins. And because of the way you describe God in your language, it's like, this is not the way it was for us. So the idea of God is not the way it was for us. So it's on the comments of all that I have said and invention of God and what it is right now, and if you can, what it will be in the future.
Which I wouldn't agree with the word inventing, the invention of God, in the sense that I don't think somebody I like origins, I like evolution, the evolution of the idea. Because even when you talk about polytheism and all that ancestor worship, many of these things, they all come together. But my point is that there was a coming together, very critical period in history, somewhere between 2000 or BC 300 or something up to about 1500. That when you had the modern idea, not the Hindu and Buddhist idea, but the Western Europe and Semite idea of God. But all of that came from somewhere. It all came back from somewhere. And you're saying, what was the contribution of Africa to that? You alluded to the ideas of Africa. They contribute to the idea of God. It's where we've got to today, where this idea that God is a Caucasian with a grey beard, there in heaven, and he's obviously, he's racist. The sort of idea that, because if you go back to the colonialists, they genuinely believed they were bringing enlightenment, and in many cases, I suppose they were bringing education, at least, to the uncivilized. And, their ideas of God, even Darwin, who caused the greatest, I can't say evolution of thinking, revolution of thinking of his day. He was also very much a man of his age in terms of his images of God and that kind of thing. So, but you have to trace way back in history to find out, I suppose to the cave drawings and whatever, to find out how these images of God evolved and how they came together into what is a modern, maybe more Semitic idea than the ones that you're talking about. Your idea, I think, is very interesting because you're saying, well, it's the rise of China. What's that going to do? But who knows? Yeah. So one of the issues about Africa is the lack of documentation. You know, there's. I mean, I was in
Actually, Ian, the dominance of knowledge, epistemology, how we know, how we preserve knowledge, how we know what we know, and so on. The tragedy of Africa, if there are any peoples who were totally, in ways in which we became dominated, and attempts to completely uproot our civilizations and so on. I don't know. I haven't read enough of India. I've read quite a bit of the indigenous peoples of North America and South America, indigenous peoples of Australia. And in a sense, you can actually say the exploitation, the conquest idea that Europe had in the late 15th century, early 16th, 17th, that is concluded really with the Enlightenment period. The greatest success is North America, South America, and I'm therefore suggesting that these areas, the close to wiping out are people, their roots, their heritage.
It was genocide.
Yeah. And I think the attempt of Africa failed. The success is phenomenal, but it failed because I think either we were the origin. I would like to. Therefore, we had something about us that was, anyway, all to say is that, but speaking of what Mazrui says, the conquest of Africa, the conquest, the domination of the mind, the soul, everything is so fundamental that Ian, you can too say that Europeans brought civilization. I mean, I know what you mean, but that even you, Ian, can say Europeans brought civilization because our history, I mean, we were judged.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying the Europeans said they were bringing civilization.
That's what they said.
Yeah, that's what they said.
But you said that.
No, that's what I meant.
Moment, there's something you said. When you said we don't record, but actually it's simply that the way in which we keep memory, we record, is not in books and papers.
In oral history, yeah.
And oral history is as credible a source of history as written history. There's absolutely nothing about written history because after all, written history itself is decoded, is taken from its roots is oral history. Yeah. So we really have had custodians and David, younger scholars, and that was part of the work I did. When I went to do my PhD in Edinburgh, I was required to do research in archives, by archives, libraries. And I was researching on Christianity in this country. And to do archival research meant that I was following the story as written by the owners of archives. Who are the owners of archives? The Europeans, right?
It's the victors who read the
Thank you very much. And I refused actually. I said I'm not going to use archives because I made a case for archives in African epistemic systems. How do Africans store knowledge? So we have a whole tradition of elders. We have a whole tradition of inheritance that actually preserves this. So, David, in the way you have read the things that are available in the literature, it is true that in dominant literature, the ideas of God that dominate are European. They are. But actually, I will tell you, in the practice, in the beliefs and practices of a typical, I could even argue, Christian in this country, a typical Christian anywhere on the continent, actually their way of thinking and acting is more informed by African ideas of God than actually European. Now, there is a disconnect. There is a complete disconnect. And that is why, by far and large, Christianity is a very much still a colonial construct. So the point you make about invention, I think to the extent that the word invention means construct, there is no doubt, in my view, that religion is a social construct. That is to say that it emerges out of social contexts, you know, and that ideas of God within that context are themselves constructed in that context. And that's why I like that book, A History of God, because all that Karen Armstrong does is show the contexts that have given birth to ideas. However, to the extent, and this is my reading, my view out of this, is that to the extent that we share something as humans, to the extent that we share something that is common to us as humans, there is something that what's the science of being human? Those things that we share as humans. There is a way in which those genes, those chromosomes, those things that we share as humans create an imagination of transcendence that has similarities. So some of the interesting studies now is, rather than read the Holy Scriptures of the Old Testament and the New Testament through the eyes of the English language, through the eyes of European missionary, what would it look like if we read the scriptures of the Old Testament and the New through the eyes of the African religion, African traditional practices and beliefs? And actually it is happening. And David, it is surprising how the imaginations of who God is in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, is actually very akin to imaginations of Iman. So the Hebrew word in Genesis 1 is Elohim. And there is a way in which research, again, among Hebraic and Judaic thinking that is rooted in the Yahweh tradition and so on, trace it back to Elohim. Actually, it's amazing how ideas of Elohim and ideas of Imana, Katonda, and the deputies, Imanwa, what are the gods of the Baganda, Mukasa. All of those actually are both in the Old Testament. And so there's absolutely no problem. So it is not true that Africans in their spirituality, in the way they express their beliefs and practices, that their view is informed by God. And that is why missionaries have had a problem. That's why missionaries often will say that Christianity is a mile wide and an inch deep. It's a mile wide. We've accepted it because it's a new social phenomenon. We must put on ties and these shirts. What do you want us to do? We must buy into this new social order. But actually, in terms of appreciating what being human is and the transcendence, I think it's much deeper than I think.
I wanted to bring in the point that you raised about the different, because I'm going back again to origins.
Yes.
You have an African origin, you have a colonial
origin
beyond that, or the Semitic origin or whatever. One of the things that has impacted me most in my now 37 years of living here is the culture of what you're part of. People, I think, have little idea of how much they're affected by the culture that they're in. And you've just been alluding to the Mugani, the gods, the Baganda gods, and so on. And I've read some of that stuff. I mean, my knowledge is much more superficial than yours, but you just see the parallels, as you say. You said about humanity itself taking in a certain direction. But and a lot of what you can see here in terms of religion is syncretism. You see it in the modern religion as well, in modern, Church of Uganda and all that. But the effect of culture, that particular culture that you're in, is profound, is absolutely profound. And I find that's probably the biggest impact that on me as an Irishman, growing up in a very parochial Northern Irish culture, where I grew up in, I was from the Unionist tradition or the Protestant tradition, and I came up with my strong beliefs. And then coming to this culture, as you said, as a missionary, and then really questioning a lot of I never questioned the reason I came here. By the way, the reason I came here was humanitarian, that I was a doctor and I felt, as I say, I have a low boredom threshold, and I also sort of question things. And I didn't feel I was doing much good back in Ireland. And that's when the AIDS epidemic was here. And I felt, let me say, as a naive do-gooder, you might say, which is sometimes the worst possible. It can be the worst thing. But when I came here, I possibly, because I was naive, because I didn't think I was an expert, because I was humble enough to just become part, in the society that I was part of. I think the worst thing that I could have done is if I'd come here as an expert. If I'd come here thinking I know all about Africa, I know about this and I know about that. But when I came, I just knew how much I didn't know. I knew my medicine and I knew, and I think the effect of being part of any culture is profound. And I think there's a huge lack of appreciation of African culture. And those African cultures, of course, then you have the Ugandan culture, you have the Buganda culture, you have the different, because Africa is such a patchwork of things. And you're saying that it's contributed to the origins of the ideas of God and all that sort of thing. My point was, I take your point about the oral tradition is important and so on. I didn't say the Europeans brought civilization here. They thought they brought civilization here.
No, we're together.
Yeah. But the culture was here. I mean, obviously, Buganda had
and every culture is a civilizational form.
Yeah.
Because every culture provides the milieu, the context in which people make sense of the world.
Yes.
And so they live.
Yeah.
And they were living hundreds of years.
But what I want to say is, we said, where's Africa going forward?
Yeah.
The problem is that, well, not a problem, but the fact is that since World War II, we've had globalization, we've had, the World Trade Organization, we've got, free trade, which the present administration in America has taken a sledgehammer to. Because of globalization, as I say, Africa's economy and everything is, 2% or something. You've got all these young people and all this potential here, but right on the periphery of where the world is. And the question really now is, and also its culture being marginalized, and things like scientific research and so on, all the money going to one particular place. So my question would be, where is African culture is strong? African culture is valid. You can't say that Western culture, European culture that's right and that's wrong. Like, I think it's crazy when I see some, agencies come here and they start to put in a framework by which, you see it in medicine, by which, this is how you should be, because this is right and this is wrong. There's no such thing.
Yeah.
There's no such thing. What will happen beyond my life and your life, but over the next 10, 20, 30 years?
I think there are signs. Let me suggest one. There's another book written by a social scientist. I think it's Philip Jenkins, The Next Christendom.
I don't know.
And he's asking the question is, where would the next heartlands of Christianity be now that Christianity is in accelerated recession in the West? And he points to Africa. And there were scholars before him, Andrew Walls, Kwame Bediako, an African. Actually, the one before that even was John Beatty, Kenyan as well, who was remarkable in thinking about the ideas of God within African concepts of God. So there are actually books written. Truthfully, yes, it's true that your generation, David, are not reading those books. The books are not being republished. So the books are being published more that you will read European ideas. Yeah. They are not in our libraries. They're not required reading in our classes, unfortunately. And unfortunately, they are also not required readings or theological origins.
If I can just ask you a question, interrupt you on this. I'm not talking about culture as it relates to theology or whatever. I'm talking about Africa.
Well,
On the breadth of it, because we've been discussing theology quite a lot, so I'd like to take the discussion more broad.
religion is an integral part of culture. You can't discuss African culture without discussing ideas of the transcendent, ideas of God. And actually, again, back to the whole notion of religion, in all Bantu languages I have checked, there is no equivalent word for religion.
I'm not.
So what I'm simply saying, I am agreeing. I'm bringing the question of culture.
Yeah.
I'm actually going a little bit beyond to say that what I was going to point to is that the future populations of the world, Paris is less Caucasian today.
It's very a lot of Africans in Paris just come back from that.
I think I can't remember the last statistics, but the Caucasian originals of that particular brand of human beings is increasingly becoming a minority. That you can say about London. If you look at, and this is a huge debate in family planning, the programs by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that are trying to control family planning. These migrations from Africa to Europe, and one of the things I'm simply suggesting that the change is going to be signaled, if by nothing else, demographic shifts. So that's massive.
But
so
yes,
as peoples move, I'm going to one factor that is evident, that today's vibrant Christianity in Europe is actually African. Now
you're back to Christianity and religion again. Look at science, look at medicine, look at research, look at
cannot get there. You see, I argue that the idea, and I really, and that's a challenge. Of course, we're talking about what I'm talking about, the idea of transcendence. So, for example, the idea within European civilization of the individual self, the individual, the autonomous self.
Yeah.
I am. No. I think therefore I am. I think therefore I am. It's definitive of the culture of Europe, isn't it?
You mean individualism?
Yes. And you cannot discuss individualism without an idea of transcendence. Because in a sense, it is to say that transcendent is the individual. You find transcendence within the individual.
What's your definition of transcendence?
That which is great, definitive of who you are, where you are, what you need to be.
Okay, but I'd like us to broaden the discussion from, I know religion is key, but from that into what?
And thought. Capitalism is itself an extension of the autonomous self. That's what it is. That's the philosophical background of capitalism. So the philosophical background, it's back to philosophy. Please go ahead. Yeah.
It's greed.
Yeah. These things are crucial. So this difference, by the way, is essential. The way you bring conversation, and I do. This is the difference between me and you. Is that for me, the eyes I use to understand the world is steeped into the idea of the man who. What the invisible looks like. That's totally, completely African. So, can I have a conversation about reality without considering the transcendent reality? I can. And I also receive what you are saying. Let's not have a discussion on religion. I think that this itself shows you how different we are.
That's how we'll get on now. So the thing is that what I'm saying is, I do believe that Africa has a lot to offer the world. I mean, I'm steeped in Uganda and East Africa. I can't say I know all of Africa, but there are a lot of similarities between the countries. And I believe it has its own unique view and its own unique cultures, which you find. And that in itself, if you let me give you an example. Having a parochial view of life, as I had when I was in Northern Ireland, and I just saw one side of this Protestant Catholic Unionist Republican debate, that gives a problem. Yeah, we all know that, Same things happen in the Middle East. When you stand back a bit and you have a larger view of the world, it helps in terms of It just helps a lot. So a global view of the world is important, but your global view will be affected by your culture, your own culture, where you come from, Uganda, Ireland, wherever it is. And what I want to know is how the culture in Africa, in Uganda, in Buganda, in Kenya, wherever, is going to contribute to the global view of the world, and therefore to the contribution that Africans make to that. I just came back from Paris, and it was interesting. I got the flight from Brussels to Paris. Most of the flight was African, and when I was in Paris, definitely there's a higher proportion of Africans than in many other countries, possibly even London.
That's true.
And that's great. But I wondered to myself, now these Africans who've come from West Africa, probably a lot from West Africa, and from different parts, I didn't really find out. There was one girl, the flight hostess, on the way back, I said she was black. And I said, you're from Belgium. Yeah, but, and she said, yes, I'm from Antwerp. That's as far as she was going to go in terms of her ancestry. It's not even politically correct to ask people where they come from. But I wonder whether, when you get all this immigration, the whatever culture those people had and way of thinking, it'll just be diluted, it'll be dissipated in the European culture. I'm not saying that's bad necessarily, but it's what do we bring? I say we as an African, as an Irish African living here, what do we bring to the world? And you've gone into the theology and the history and all that, it's fine. But I'm looking at today, I'm looking at the next 10 years. I'm looking at these young people. And I'm saying, Africa to me has been squeezed out. It's been, the resources that are allocated to Africa, what is it Donald Trump called the shithole country?
And I would say,
and even I mean with the wave of immigration, what's that going to bring? Is that going to bring, I don't know, a view, another view, and something positive, or it's just going to bring a reaction? And
so I think, one, the global economic order as it exists now has its roots within the Industrial Enlightenment. And you can't separate the current global economic order from Conquest, from European Conquest.
No.
Number two, you can't separate that global economic order from a particular, you talk about culture, and I completely agree. But we also need to think about culture as a way of seeing, living in the world, a worldview, coded beliefs and practices. So that's a worldview. And we can't deny that today's global economic order is shaped by European worldview. Therefore, European, and that's why I'm going back to individualism and the autonomous self and so in the Enlightenment period. Now, I agree with you in asking, what will Africa bring? I personally, from a perspective, a reading of history that I have, is that this way of seeing the world has to end, has to be decimated, has to come to an end before you have a new way of re-seeing the world that will be dominant. I would say, I think it was Bush who talked about
the first
Emergence, the second Bush, who talked about the clash of civilizations.
Axis of evil.
No, I'm thinking more of the clash of civilizations. Axis of evil is. Or was it Chirac, the French?
Okay.
A clash of civilizations. I think that Trump and team, my thinking broadly, are accelerating the demise of the Western view of the world as the dominant view.
Yeah.
And my question is, what is China bringing into this?
Yeah.
Is China's way of thinking the world going to dominate? Now, the question you ask, what is Africa's view of the world that's going to come in?
And its contribution.
I think that Africa's contribution, and I see it in various quarters, is the idea of understanding what it means to be human as corporate. The idea is that, again, I quote John Beatty, I am because we are, therefore I am. This idea that our destinies are intertwined, this idea of the solidarity, it's within the Bantu languages, it's what's called Ubuntu. What does an Ubuntu economy look like? What does an economy that cares about the other look like? If you check, now critics have argued that the corruption as a way, a practice, is also steeped within African societies, that when a person gets rich, enters a public office, it's not just him who has entered the public office. His relatives have entered the public office. So they all must benefit. But having spoken about that ill, it's one way in which I think Africans have tried to make sense of this capitalist idea of running of the world. And I think that this corporate self, this Ubuntu, this communitarian self, that I am because we are, I would say, Ian, it's precisely my relationship with you. We are different, but the way we share our lives is phenomenal. The way we share our lives. And I think it's this kind of solidarity, this way of thinking economies that is not just about me. And I think it's going to get into the world. I am hoping so. I think that there are business people today, African businessmen, who are reimagining that. The owner of Airtel, what's his name? He created a fund for presidents who would
retired.
Respectful. I forget his name. Mo Ibrahim. We have Dangote is doing some very interesting things. And I think that there are Africans who are simply wanting to structure, to bring this Ubuntu into a way of not only seeing the world, but seeing the other. So that this idea of exclusion and so on and so forth, hopefully. And I think that this is something that is going to be, I think it's contrary to, as I see it. I think that the Chinese way of extraction is a different form of European extraction. It's all extraction. And the joyful thing is that Africans don't go to a place to conquer it. And I think that this way of living alongside other human beings and finding a way in which we live together, I hope that will be a contribution that Africans bring.
Yeah,
I hope so too.
So, as we close up, I just want us to talk about the future. The last part of the quote was about how the Europeans invented the world. And as Zac alluded, the world we are in right now is mostly the English language, the English alphabet. Even when you are coding, you're right. Someone sent me a meme of all the programming languages that we use right now. Each of them has been created by a European. So
is that so?
Yeah.
Wow.
Right from Java, Python, all that. And and we have the future.
Question, frankly. Is there no programming languages in the Chinese characters, the Chinese syntax and or we don't know?
I don't know.
The program, the common ones, you can make up a language, but the most used languages in the world are all based on English words.
Yeah. So right now the most used language is Python. Then there's R, there's JavaScript, there are new ones, and they're all created by Europeans. And beyond that, the economics, the way countries decide to distribute resources, whether capitalism or public goods, it's all a European construct. The way education is, the way schools are, the way roads are, it's mostly European. The way governments are, democracy, the way power is divided, it's European. And so in a way, the world we are in is mostly European. But then we have the future. And the future can be anything. Some people have said we are in a time that is akin to the Renaissance. You mentioned Yuval Noah's Nexus. We see that with drastic changes in how information is interpreted and used, human beings have cause drastic changes in how they organize themselves, in how much resources they can create, in how much they can improve life. And now we have a new way or new ways like artificial intelligence, we have biotechnology, we have robotics, and in a way, the entire world is an amateur at this. Even OpenAI, that looks to be at the helm of it, I would say, is an amateur at this. And from my standpoint, I think that means it is a golden opportunity for Africa. Because we are almost, okay, one would say the world has kicked off and we have not yet even started the race, but I'm optimistic. And I want to close this up by getting your comment on this. So Ray Dalio, one of the famous economists of our times, has mentioned that the people who create with the cutting edge technology of the time dominate, that their language becomes the most used, their currency becomes the most used, their religion becomes dominant. And we saw that with the Dutch ships. We saw that with British industrialization. And we are seeing it with the American technology. But now we have the future. And in my view is that this is a chance for Africa to do things differently, because now we are almost on the same playing field with, I would say, it's hard to say the same playing field, but there is grit in our people that can catch up. So I just want you to make comments on the future in regards with this and with young people in mind.
I mean, I think sadly the world has become populism is a force that has taken over a lot of Western countries at the present time, and it's because of a deepening gap between the rich and poor. It's because if you look at real incomes, if you take America for example, real incomes in the middle class, lower middle class have gone down, whereas you've got a lot of ultra wealthy now who've also now aligned to taken over the political classes, and so you have real inequality, and you have a real shortage of labor as well. And yet people are not seeing that we have a very young population in Africa. So why doesn't North and South just get together in terms of, that you can fill a lot of those, the gaps for employment, which, often a lot of that employment is lower level employment, but it builds, then people get an opportunity and then start. But there's a tremendous divide in the world. Well, I'm thinking my mind is actually going to India and Africa. India is also a subcontinent and huge. The populations are probably about the same, I imagine. But when I look at Indians and I see the places that they've taken in so many Indians are CEOs of these huge tech companies. So many Indians. It's not just, these are the immigrants that Trump wants to keep out, but these are the guys who are actually running those companies. And I'm actually thinking to myself, where were the Africans? And I think it goes back to something you said, Zac, about mathematics. Without that emphasis on education and that particular education, that equipped many of these Indians in a way where they were able, and they were highly motivated as well. I like what Zac has said about Ubuntu, and I really love that about Africa as well. But you need to have, to bring a cultural value like that into a society, which would bring a lot more peace in our world today than all this division that we have and extremism. It can't be done it's like, I look at these guys in Paris and I wonder, do they affect their culture, or are they just, inserted here and there in the lower level jobs and stuff, and they don't really have an influence? That's what I worry about. As you say, there's an opportunity because, AI and these things what's really affected our society today is not the historical wealth. It's the Zuckerbergs and the Musks and these guys who've created their own wealth. There's no reason why Africans can't do that. But Africans also need that opportunity because, Zac, you've been on my farm, you've seen the kids carrying firewood on their heads. If you don't give people that opportunity, they're never going to get to the point even where you're at today. David, I believe you'll achieve great things in your life. But if people don't even have the basics, and that's my worry about Africa.
I mean, I'm on the. I think that there are glimpses. I think there are. I guess my answer to you would be watch this space. Let me describe the different spaces to watch. I've already highlighted immigration. Immigration is the ways in which humanity has changed. New civilizations have emerged. The progress of Europe would not be what it is without the conquest of Africa and Asia. So the migrations are huge. We see signs of Africans who emigrated for economic, educational reasons are now champions of new technologies in the North. We can speak of many young people now who are at the helm of important technological developments in the United States. I think we're even seeing some Ugandans. There are stories of that. Certainly in Europe, we are seeing that of Nigerians, Ghanaians in high-tech centers. I mean, we have a Ugandan, I think, in Boeing. So we will have those as a result of the migrations. Why? Because we speak English. Because we speak the coding language. So, and it does not discriminate. I think it's to distinguish those who are professionals in Europe and those who are simply casual laborers in Europe because they just need an extra buck. And I think that as more you have these educated, high level. So that's one, immigration with different classes. Secondly, technology is actually shifting. And I think a good sign, and David, you must know this more than I do, is M-Pesa. So the mobile money technology, actually, its home is Kenya. And traditional banks, as you know, have sought to fight it at the beginning, but they couldn't fight it. What I was going to say is that, there are glimpses. And one, migration, and it's all complex trends, demographics, demographic distribution. And that has implications for resource utilizations and so on. And this migration within this new technological world. Number two is there are going to be surprisingly new developments in the unique contribution born and bred out of the sufferings of Africans. And the example I give is financial services. No doubt that the financial services eliminated the bulk of Africa. It was European, all the banks, either, their histories and so on. But some young people in Kenya invented M-Pesa. And the story is, initially it was fought, even here in Uganda. But when banks realized that they couldn't fight it, what have they been trying to do? Including the central bank. It was not regulated. So I think there are going to be surprisingly new ways in which young Africans who have this knowledge but also come out of this context work together. So I think that the mobile money technology, is really one sign of what might come. There are interesting responses that I have seen, younger people, and please go and look for them. There is some really interesting technologies that take seriously African approaches to the practice of medicine that are beginning to come, which I think will revolutionize healthcare. I think there is. So I think that there are signs. I think the one thing that African young people simply need to know is that they don't have to look too far. The resources are within here. Don't have to look too far. This idea of the European and the Chinese, the Asian being the masters of these things. No. These things are actually here with us. We have their language. We have an understanding. We've studied their history. They haven't studied ours because they have denigrated it. We are the experts in our own history. We're the experts in our own worldview. And I think it's just the boldness. Now, I think that all this will take as long as we are able to imagine political leadership. The conversation between the recording is about the nature of the state. Absolutely. If we do not reimagine the state, because right now, one of the biggest bottlenecks or the hindrances is the nature of the state, is the leadership of this current state. Whether we like it or not, it's a worse version of the colonial state. In fact, what they have simply done is take the colonial state and deepen its worst forms of it, whether it's plunder, whether it's all those things. So on the other side, personally, I'm glad I am alive to see the collapse of the old order.
Wow.
Whether you like it or not, the old order is collapsing. I am not thanking the likes of Donald Trump and the rise of the extreme right movement taking over European, but I think that those people are expediting the collapse of that European-based world and order. And so hopefully that will give opportunity for the emergence of something fresh. In other words, we are in a luminal moment, let's keep our eyes open, watch this space. Are you as young people watching enough? I don't know. You may be so preoccupied in the populist culture, in the social media culture, that I don't know how creative it is. So I think the answer, it would be interesting, David, to have that conversation with younger people who are thinking deeply about what the future looks like.
Thank you. I think now it's time for us to have closing words. Your takes on this discussion or parting words as we close this. I don't know. Maybe Zac was started, so probably we start with you and then.
I have no words.
It's a continuing conversation.
All right. Thank you so much.
I think it's to be able to say that, as Ian said at the beginning, we come to this because of our different roots, our histories, our formation, our socialization. There are points of convergence. There are other points of divergence. But the thing that keeps us together is the fact that we are both seekers. And some of the moments of deep learning for me and Ian is when we have disagreed. Then we are able to interrogate what are we disagreed about. So, and I hope that a conversation like this opens up people's ways, not to agree with us, but hopefully in the disagreement or in the whatever, something fresh and new could emerge.
I would like to say, as far as I'm concerned, I said earlier on that I'm no expert. I didn't come as an expert. I'm still not an expert. And it's just a collection of experiences and over a period of time. And I think that, while naivety can be a problem sometimes, at least you realize you're always learning and not coming with a sort of fixed view. And the future's there. I don't know whether I agree with you in terms of the deconstruction of the whole world order as it is and the way that it's happening. But yes, it's interesting what it'll be replaced by.
Thank you.
All right, that's great.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for listening to us. I hope this conversation got you thinking. I hope, as Zac said, if you disagree with any of these things that have been said today, it is an opportunity for you to investigate and find out what you disagree with and what you agree with. But more so, we hope that these conversations get you to question and become seekers, just like Zac and Ian is. We shall be getting you these conversations every other week, and we hope that they add to your journey of becoming a better person. And there's an opportunity for you to contribute to these conversations too. Share with us the questions that you would love Ian and Zac to answer. Thank you so much. I remain David. Till next time.